One of the problems, obviously, that has erupted in Barnham for some reason is antisocial behaviour. And we've got Jonathan with us tonight, who is our Green Party Police Crime Commissioner, PCC, candidate for Sussex. So Jonathan's going to tell us a little bit how he thinks policing would look under a Green Party Police Crime Commissioner. He's travelled a long way to be with us this evening, like really long way, so we're really grateful for that. He's a former BBC journalist and foreign correspondent with a history of campaigning on human rights, miscarriages of justice, well that's quite on topic at the moment, isn't it? Treatment of migrant workers and sex trafficking. He grew up in East Sussex and read philosophy and theology at Oxford. And yeah, so Jonathan's here tonight, having come a long way to tell us how policing might look under a Green PCC.
Hello. I have this possibly dangerous and self-destructive urge to tell you about my early experiences of policing. And this is going back to the 80s, when I had hair halfway down to my bum and used to go and see Hawkwind and played in rock bands. And so I live not far from Tunbridge Wells, out in the sticks, between the villages of Wadhurst and Ticehurst. It's quite remote. And back in those days, my father was working for the Department of the Environment. My parents always had Morris Travellers. And so we had a Morris Traveller and we had a Morris Traveller van. And to get into Tunbridge Wells, the easiest thing was to get a train. So one evening, my father very kindly took me to Wadhurst Station. And we're going up our lane, so it's a couple of miles from the main road. And we went past a side turning, which goes down to some neighbours. And there was a police car there. I was like, that's unusual. You never see anybody out here, let alone the police car. That's exciting. And so we went along and the police car turned out and followed us. So we went along about another sort of like half mile. And there was another police car. And it was waiting another side turning. And it came out in front of us. And we were still going up towards the main road, still down a side lane called Ward's Lane. So we have a police car behind us and a police car in front of us. Gosh, that's interesting. And then we got to the main road. And then we picked up a third police car. And by the time we got to Wadhurst Station, it was another 2 miles away. We kind of like drove in. And there was 2 other police cars appeared. By this time, there's 5 police cars. And one kind of like scooted ahead and blocked off the entrance in front of us. And then, I don't know what the rest, there was probably one at the far end, and there were 2 or 3 others. And they were hiding behind their doors. And they came up, and they got me to stand against the station wall, and they frisked me. And apparently, and my father, who's like 40-something, 50-something civil servant, on suspicion apparently of armed robbery. And we later find out that they were looking for somebody who is 6'3" with short curly hair driving a Porsche. I am many things. I had hair, but it wasn't short or curly. And I'm certainly not 6'3", and neither is my father. And a Morris Traveller and a Porsche, even to a police officer, I think, look relatively easily distinguished. Anyway, that was that. We didn't get an apology from them, but a couple of years later, down from university, waiting at Wadhurst Station again. Me and the police at Wadhurst Station. I've never really quite figured this one out. They pull out, and they said, there are a couple of officers in the car, and they pull up, and they said, were you breaking into that car? And I'm standing this is a car park, and I'm standing about 3 foot, 4 foot in front of a car. And I said, which car? And they pointed at one behind me, and I said, it's an Austin Princess. Who on earth is going to break into an Austin Princess? It's like, what do I want? Mantovani cassettes? Sorry, that's cruel. I hope none of you actually drove an Austin Princess back in the day. And then my mother turned up, and she was really terrifying. Particularly to police officers, and she gave them what for. She said, well, it's not surprising he's not very pleased to see you, because last time you did this, they thought he was guilty of armed robbery. Anyway, so I have had, in my younger years, interesting experiences with the police. But during my career as a journalist, I have to say, I've met I met a number of officers who I was really impressed with. And interestingly, one was the officer commanding in Oxford in the late 90s, who I interviewed, and I was really struck by it because she was clearly a remarkably intelligent woman, not really like, well, I'm not saying that I've never met an intelligent police officer, far from it, but she really stood out as being on the ball and everything, and that was Cressida Dick. And so you meet people, and I met others who were community police officers working in other parts of Oxfordshire where I was reporting, who were really inspiring. They were incredibly attached and devoted to their communities. They put in hours after work to go and work with youth groups. I remember a team working on a difficult estate in Banbury called Bretch Hill. And they were doing great work. And I think this is the point that I'm leading into, that we know what great policing looks like because we do see it on the streets of Britain. So I would never argue that we should expect police officers to do something that we know is impossible. But so many police officers model really good policing that I wonder what the excuse is for the ones in the Met, the ones who, you know, stood up for the guy who rapes and murdered Sarah Everard, what their excuse is. Now, I know Sussex police are not the Met, and when I met the Chief Constable earlier this week, it was quite obvious that there was a cultural difference between us and, in Sussex and the policing people often experience in London or have historically. But I still think there's a degree of work to do. And I was very keen to ask the Chief Constable if they had a statement of values. Because one of the things I've noticed with organisations is it helps to have a reference point. Corporations get very hung up on things called mission statements, and a lot of the time they can be utter, I don't want to use a word in polite company, but they could be nonsense, self-serving, twaddle. But it's also quite a discipline to put down in 150 words exactly what your organisation is about, what it exists to do, and what its values are, and what its goals are. And Sussex Police are quite good on having boiled down what they do. They've got it down to 3 words. They protect the public, they catch criminals, and they deliver a service. So it's protect, catch, deliver. As Jo Shiner, the Chief Constable, said, she wants her officers to know whether they're turning left or right when they go out, i.e. what the most important task they've got to do is. Fair enough. But they really floundered when I asked them what the how was, the values. Because and it does sound a bit esoteric at times, but what happens sometimes, and it's not, you do see it with the police, I saw it with the BBC, is because we have a very strong need as human beings to belong, I think is, and the more I've thought about politics in recent years, the less I think it's about a battle of ideas, and the more I tend to see it as about belonging. So people are so keen to stay in with their group, they will shift their thinking, as you've seen in America with QAnon, with Trump supporters and so on. They will shift their thinking to stay with the group, because losing your friends, losing your family, your support network is quite devastating, and that happens with institutions too, with the big dodgy dossier thing that happened to the BBC 20 odd years ago at the height of Iraq and everything. There was a real sense of the BBC needed to be defended. And you see the same thing with institutions like the police. And I think it's really important, rather than defend the institution, you defend the principles that underpin it. And that's why I think it's important that people have a really clear idea of what the principles they are standing up for are. So the police, so Jo Shiner and colleagues didn't come up with a value statement about, they said, they refer to the College of Policing. Well, I'd want every officer in Sussex to go out there knowing not just the what they're doing, but the how they're supposed to be doing it. And eventually one of them, who I think was on the HR side, came up with courage, honesty, and treating the public with respect and empathy, I think it was. I may have misremembered, but I thought that's good. But, along with protect, catch, serve, it's like, I need to be honest, I need to be courageous, and I need to be respectful and empathetic when I'm dealing with members of the public. Keep that in your mind. It's not, I think all of us could do that. Would stand people in good stead. So In terms of policing, what I'd like to see generally, and not just here, in police services, and I'd like them to think of themselves as police services and not forces, is how they do their job day to day. And, you know, nobody's expecting somebody who's dealing with a potentially violent situation to be a social worker or to be, you know, unnecessarily polite. But, you know, just in dealing with members of the public, to keep those values in mind. Now, in terms of what we are looking for as a party, we're very focused on things like restorative justice. How many of you are familiar with the principles of restorative justice? Okay. It's a process that happens after the facts have been established, and it's normally after a criminal or a criminal process, or somebody's accepted responsibility. And as part of the process, the person who is responsible for the crime, if the victim is amenable, and only if they're amenable, they sit down together so that the person who's done whatever has happened is left in no doubt whatsoever what the impact has been on the person whose life they have affected. And often if somebody breaks into your house, they take something maybe fairly trivial, but this impact on you having your space violated can be enormous. It can leave some people completely derailed. And people who do things often, you know, young men tend to be quite, you know, when you're in your late teens, your early 20s, lots of young men will take risks and not think about consequences, you know, particularly with friends and so on. And so it becomes a real shock to realize that the thing that you thought was just a laugh has really, you know, had an enormous psychological impact on someone. So I think bolting on or moving from a purely criminal justice system into a criminal justice plus restorative justice system brings victims into the process, and it also can often have a far more profound effect on perpetrators than just finding them, giving them community service, or locking them up. We have other priorities as well. We want to focus on the safety of women and girls. We shouldn't have to, but when I was in Brighton recently, I was knocking on doors, and asked quite a few students, women, how they felt about being out in Brighton. And most of them said, well, it's a lot safer than where I come from. And they come from towns around the country. So, but two or three said, I still think about when I go out. And I don't think that's right. I don't think any of us should think that's right, that people have to adjust where they go and who they see and how they dress and so on, just to avoid trouble. Because if you don't, then you're somehow your legitimate target. So I'd like to make that a priority as well. And in terms of another thing that the Police and Crime Commissioner does is they have a small budget outside funding the police, which they can divert to things that they may think will have an impact on crime and criminal justice. And I would like to use that portion of the Police and Crime Commissioner's budget to go towards youth services, because one of the things that's happened over the last 15 years is services for young people have been gutted. And finally, the other thing I think you would find with a Green Police and Crime Commissioner, and in a moment I'm going to go and ask all of you, or any of you who want to chip in, what your particular concerns are, is crime doesn't happen in a vacuum. I know we like to think that actually it's just bad people, and there are a few bad people, and mostly there's good people. Well, if that were the case, crime wouldn't go up when the use of food banks go up. Shoplifting wouldn't go up when people are on the edge. And we're in a situation now where people can be doing 2 or 3 jobs and still struggling. You know, I imagine most of you have found in the last 2 or 3 years that things have got a lot tighter. And, you know, that contributes to other things, you know, the stress of dealing with heating your home and paying your bills. You see an uptick in domestic violence. It's sad, but it happens. And one of the things that the Chief Constable pointed out, and this is one of the reasons you may not see as many officers responding to antisocial behaviour, which I know you have a problem with around here, is they often have teams of officers, numerous teams of officers. They might have like 50 or 60 officers or even 35, 40 officers to deploy across the county, and 6 or 8 of them are dealing with people in mental health crisis because there are no social services left to speak of. You know, they have to send people out in twos because if it's somebody in mental health crisis, and this shouldn't be a matter of blame, somebody is not well, but they are not necessarily responsible for how they react, and they could be a danger, so you don't send officers singly. And when they take that person to A&E or to local mental health services, they could be waiting hours with somebody in mental health crisis in order for someone to come free from trying to deal with the rest of it in order to take this person into more appropriate care. And the police do not want to be doing that. But have you heard a Conservative police and crime commissioner speak up and say, well, actually part of our problem is over the last 15 years, services in local authorities, social services, youth services, mental health services have been torn apart by austerity? You don't. But that is the world that the police are having to deal with. So as police and crime commissioner, I would leave no one in any doubt that crime happens in a social context as well as being the responsibility of the person who has carried out the crime. Right, that's me. Would you mind if I take the microphone around and see if there are any of you who would like to share your concerns about crime and criminal justice issues locally? Hi.
I'm also Jonathan, and maybe also there's a couple of other associations. I've worked overseas in conflict zones. I've worked with the BBC, Julian in Bristol, and I worked with Sandy Gore in Wales. Okay, I think where I stand on this is that what troubles me about and forgive me for sort of coining a phrase that may not be appropriate, but the green approach, is that I think the sort of feedback, and I have been sort of a bit involved with the recent antisocial behaviour issue online and so on with the parish council, is that, you know, we've had years and years and years of what I would call mamby-pamby politics concerning crime and the ability of the police and the courts to deal with it. And you know something, as far as I can see, it's a project that hasn't worked, and I think that the proof is in the pudding. You know, what I think a lot of people I would like to perhaps say on behalf of, certainly my neighbours as well, is that what we need strong, decisive deterrence to deal with this issue, because inevitably the trouble is that if you don't have those deterrents, then I don't believe that we're going to actually crack this problem, because of the history of what we've seen in schools. We've got a daughter who's just finished school. You know, we've seen it over years. I'm sure lots of other families has as well. As far as I'm concerned, the comparatively softly approach hasn't worked, and this is a proof of the pudding. And I think that it's an issue that's building up and has built up over decades. Certainly I've seen it over decades. And I think it's come home to roost now. So I'm not with you on that as far as, you know, the approach by the Green Party, because I look upon it as a rather sort of liberal policy, and I think that's a problem in itself, because I think we need the opposite.
Okay, I'll deal with that in a second. Any more for any more?
Behind you.
Oh. Which of you had your hand up first, and then is it you or your pooch who wants to say something? Are you happy with local policing?
Well, yes, because the officers are always lovely to her, to be fair. Sit down. Well, I'm really pleased to hear you talk of restorative justice. My previous role was inspecting prisons, and one of the things that they were doing is using restorative justice programs. Now, there are some people that no matter what you do, they're going to be bad. I'm sorry, but it's true. But there's a lot of people who, once they recognise the effect they have had on a specific individual, they are utterly mortified, and they are truly then repentant, not in a godly way, but they are repentant of what they have done. So restorative justice for certain people really is an effective tool, and quite a simple tool in actuality. But as a commissioner, does your policy really have an effect on outcomes, on will we see a difference? How will your effect as a Green Party commissioner be measured?
Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question to you is, at the higher levels, how can we, why aren't they leading by example, the ministers? If you look at the Ofsteds, if you look at the regulators that are out there, none of them are doing their jobs properly. If you look at the Financial Services Association, if you look at even Companies House, half of them, the information that's on the web and when you phone them, it's totally wrong. What are you going to do to actually rectify it? Because if there's correction at the top, it's bound to travel down slowly. But if things are wrong at the top, it's going to continue here. And as somebody just said, we don't have a deterrent. These kids are running around with a badge on the thing saying, I beat the police.
When you say that the organisations at the top, are you meaning things like the Inspectorate of Constabulary and things like that?
No, we're talking about the Ofsteds for schools, the
Right.
regulators for financial houses, things like that, because that's where a lot of the debt starts happening. People get scammed, the phone scams, things like that, which all comes back down, yeah.
Okay.
It comes down to antisocial behaviour, but it stems from the very top, I think, and we need a good example. The people aren't setting a good example. You're not going to actually follow it all the way through because they say, that's happened.
Okay. Anyone else?
Hi, this is not a question. I'm thinking about evidence-based research that looks at the correlation between crime and the gap between rich and poor, which is evidence-based. When you have a bigger gap, you get more crime. So policing is not, it shouldn't be used as something at the end of the road. We should be looking like people who get sick. Why are they getting sick? What's happening? Why are they doing this? Not, and it's like wagging a finger at the NHS at the end of the road. It's like the police as well, at the end. We have to look at our society, we have to look at our communities, we have to look at what we are doing wrong that makes those kids turn out like that. Look at the pressure they are under. Look at the pressures they're under. They're going to schools which are they're not built properly. They're full of asbestos. They're crumbling. So let's look at those things first before just saying, let's have deterrence. The deterrent is in the community.
Anyone else? Okay.
Following on from that, I think it's also about the example that's being set by the political party at the top and the behaviour there.
I have to say I'm not responsible for them. And as Sussex Police and Crime Commissioner, I think there would be a limited amount that I could do about Grant Shapps. Has anybody actually noticed this? I've been wanting to say for a while. Does anybody remember Roland Rat from the 80s?
Yes.
Has anybody ever seen Grant Shapps and Roland Rat in the same place? Let me deal with some of the points. I think they're very fair. So, gentleman over there. We're not talking doing away with the criminal justice system. I think everybody knows that if actions have consequences. I think that the point the lady made there about that not being necessarily modelled at the top is probably quite telling. So, yes, some things flow up, but an awful lot flows down. If we have the people who run our country flagrantly disobeying the law, the whole thing with the PPE scandal, I think, utterly shocking. I'm not a huge fan of the Labour Party, though I know lots of people within the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, even Tories who as individuals I actually really like. And I actually really admire Angela Rayner, because if anybody knows her history, she has battled considerable obstacles through life to be deputy leader of the Labour Party. And when people have been basically lining their pockets with tens, hundreds of millions of quid on PPE contracts and stuff, half the press is having a go at her over 1,500 quid from a council house sale. You know, what does it say for people? It basically says that the criminal justice, she gets prosecuted, it'll say, and maybe she's in the wrong, in which case there should be consequences, sure. But for a lot of people there haven't been consequences. Michelle Mone, nobody's talking yet about bringing charges against her for 25 million quid or something for PPE that had to be thrown away. I can't remember what the figures were, but they were monstrous. And you can't have the perception that the criminal justice system is simply there to keep the haves where they are and the have-nots quiet and subservient. We need a criminal justice, and this is one of the reasons we need values to underpin policing, because justice is depicted as blind for a reason. It needs to treat each of us equally and at the same time see us as individuals. So none of us gets to escape the consequences of the law, but each of us, you know, if we are pulled up in front of a court, gets a trial that takes the wider circumstances into account. So when I talk about restorative justice, as I tried to emphasize earlier, this is not the whole of the justice process. It's once you have been through a criminal justice process and somebody has been convicted, you then go into a restorative justice process so they actually have to face the consequence of their actions. It helps the victim heal, it helps the perpetrator come to terms with what they've done. So I'm not an advocate of namby-pamby anything, but I do think context is important. Thank you for your contribution about that. And again, I would agree that there are psychopaths, there are people who've been mentally very damaged, who are a danger to society, and sadly, you know, detention is an option, right? But there's no escaping that. But don't know if you remember the 2011 riots, which were quite scary. But there was one guy who was convicted for 4 years. He was sentenced to 4 years for stealing a bottle of water from a shop. 50,000 quid a year, I think it costs to keep someone in prison. That's a very expensive bottle of water. Did it serve any purpose? It's a signal to rioters: don't riot, don't get involved. But does it look like justice? I don't know. I think that's each and every one of us will have an opinion on that. So, and the gentleman there who's talking about Ofsted and various other things. I was chatting to a friend today who actually works for Ofsted, and he thinks that there are quite a few people in Ofsted that he would gently move into other jobs. Fellow inspectors who don't go into schools with empathy. He says, you know, the funny thing is that not very nice ones come to the same conclusions as the ones who are perfectly lovely to work with. They both give the schools the same rating, but it's just a small minority makes it hell for the teaching staff in the process. Where fraud's concerned, I think I have to say that this is something that we need to address, because a lot of fraud these days happens online, and it all goes to action fraud. You're told to ring them and not the police, and not very much happens. So I think we need police officers really who are increasingly digitally literate and are able to help. Because you say Bobby's on beat. Well, if the beat happens to be online, then you need Bobbies working online to prevent fraud. And unfortunately, because a lot of it is international, that's quite hard. But yes. Anyway, probably enough from me. You've probably heard enough to make up your minds whether you want to vote for me or not. Like I said, Greens are very much about policing and community being indivisible, Because it's one thing to be told off by a police officer, but if all your neighbours kind of like look at you, knowing they've got the backup of the police, going, we don't like you doing that. You know, if you want to be part of this community, mend your ways. That's a lot more powerful than just having a couple of bobbies going around and then disappearing. So it's going to be criminal justice under, you know, in a green system is a combination of people, police, as one, working together. So you cannot get a Rizzler paper, pardon the pun, between the two. There you go. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not sure Sue needs much introduction, but for those of you, if there is anyone here who doesn't know Sue, she is a sitting Green Party councillor for Barnham Ward of Arun District Council and is the leader of the Green Group on Arun District Council. She is chair of the Environment Committee, of course, and vice chair of the Planning Committee. She's had a rough 6 months, which she's going to tell us about when she's asked the question or spoken to Jonathan.
Thank you, Faye. Good evening, everyone. Jonathan, what I wanted to say to you is that there were 13 police to police the whole of Bognor, Chichester, right up to Littlehampton, when all of this trouble has occurred here. There are only 4 British Transport Police that work from Portsmouth Harbour to Gatwick. Pretty shocking. Just a bit of food for thought for you.
Well, we need pitchforks to go to West Sussex.
But
with little rubber things on the end of the pitchfork so you can't get arrested.
and also, Arun District Council's anti-behaviour social team have actually employed 2 security guards that are in the village from 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock for 21 days to deter the youngsters because they have not got enough police on the ground.
There was a time when people were... Does anybody know the you probably do, the song Taxman by the Beatles? It's on Revolver, great song, George Harrison. There's a line in that, there's 19 for you and 1 for me. Back in the mid-60s, the top rate of tax was 95%. Now we have a government that's afraid of taxing people earning over £1 million at sort of like 50%. So if you want good services, unfortunately, at some point they've got to be paid for. That's not in the gift of the Police and Crime Commissioner. You can put in an application for an extra precept and get people to pay a bit more locally. But what's happened over the last 15 years is central government has seen local government as an easy target for cuts, which is why so many of the cuts have fallen on local government, why even Conservative councils are going bust. Because it saves them picking up the tab, because they're not prepared to fund services properly. If any of you are interested in the things that underpin this, I read something very interesting recently about an American economist, I'm not sure he's still alive, called, I forget his first name, I think it's James, but it's Buchanan. And he's a contemporary of a lot of the Chicago school economists. But he was very influential on the American right and on, I think, people like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Don't quote me on that. They might deny that. But Buchanan thought that the state was there to be dismantled. His vision of America was one where, you know, it was all paid for. If you wanted services, you got it from a big corporation, and there was no government. If we don't have a government, somebody else will step in to provide that, and it'll be a very different society. And I always say to this, you know, people are very proud of the NHS. A lot of British people think it's one of our greatest achievements. That was set up in the wake of the Second World War as a tribute to a nation that had gone through the Blitz and subsequent bombing campaigns. The V1s and V2s came over my part of the world. We were in Doodlebug Alley. There was something like 140 of them fell on the 4 parishes around where I live in East Sussex on the way up to Croydon and London. It was a nation that had suffered together. And there was a really strong feeling that, one, government was quite good at doing things because it got us through the war. and had organised things pretty well. And secondly, the nation that had gone through hell together deserved to be kept well together. And we seem to have lost that. I think that was dismantled in the 80s. It makes me very cross, because I think we have a duty of care to one another as fellow citizens. You know, I don't want to be stepping over people in the street because they're homeless. I don't want to be looking at somebody, I don't want to be in an American situation where you wonder whether your neighbour's going to be able to afford healthcare. You know, I think, you know, there needs to be the freedom to be the best person you can be, to start your business or pursue your career and go through life and achieve something. You know, we shouldn't all be sort of like in like Soviet Russia, put into cookie cutter jobs and told what to do. But equally, I don't think we can want a society where people climb to the top over the bruised and broken bodies of their fellow citizens. So if you want better policing, we're going to have to pay for it at some point.
Thank you for that.
We're back off to the far side of Sussex now. It's been lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.